This is part 2 of the FEMA Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program Advanced Assistance webinar. Your presenters are Brenna Humphrey and Stephen Randolph with FEMA Region 10.
So now we're going to discuss advanced assistance and how that can be used for project scoping. So here's a little breakdown of the mitigation process. Phase 1 would be your mitigation planning. So, what risks and hazards does your community face? And again, a mitigation plan is required for advanced assistance. So phase 2 would be the project scoping, looking at alternatives to your project, looking at things to consider, your environment, community engagement. Is the community for the project? Is it something that's going to help them or potentially have negative buy-in? And then that it meets our PDM grant requirements. And then the phase 3 would be your application development, and that would be you submitting the project for another fiscal year. So how can advanced assistance help with project scoping? It can do this by providing funding to staff and contract resources. So let's say you have a hazard of flooding in your community, but you don't know, should I elevate all these houses? Should I move them? That you can use this advanced assistance money to work through problems like that, evaluate the facilities you're looking at to determine if that mitigation action of elevation or relocation is right, and getting engineering reports and feasibility studies. Could a house even be raised? Is it in a condition that can be elevated? You can also incorporate EHP considerations into these early decisions. Maybe you're looking at an area that is culturally sensitive, that might be on the National Historic Register. So you can start planning ahead of time and getting EHP considerations preloaded, so that way when you submit that application, that project is ready for EHP review. You can also conduct hazard risk studies to help quantify your problem and come up with different types of alternatives. It is limited in the flood study work to proposed project sites, so you can't just look at a whole county or such, but maybe you want to go on a really detailed look at a certain area. You can certainly do that with advanced assistance. Or you're wanting to fund geotech, LIDAR, some wildfire hazard mapping for that area. It can also be used to collect data for any type of evaluation or design you're needed, like engineering studies or any type of documentation and information that an engineer may need to evaluate whatever project you're looking at. And also conduct community engagement with meetings or outreach and make sure that the community is for the project that you're looking at submitting before you submit a project that maybe your community doesn't support. So the hazard mitigation plan. So first of all, as we've mentioned a few times, it is required for advanced assistance. And that's because your plan is essentially the cornerstone of projects. And this is required by Congress. And so what this means is your plan should be consistent with whatever you're applying for advanced assistance and for a project. If your plan focuses only on flood and never mention earthquakes, you shouldn't be submitting earthquake projects or advanced assistance out of nowhere. So you want to make sure there's some consistency with your plan. And you update your plan every 5 years, so there is that option to continue studying risks and hazards for your community to make sure that those are updated every 5 years with the most relevant information. So your project should come out of the plan. Projects can be specific in your plan, or locations can be identified, and they have to relate clearly to the policy objectives that the particular hazard in your community is faced with. So like buyouts, seismic retrofits, things like that. And again, back to that example, flood buyouts, that would be great if your plan focuses on floods, and maybe in your plan you highlight some communities that have really bad flooding and consistent flooding, then maybe flood buyouts. That would work great with your plan. Here is one of my favorite documents. It's called Mitigation Ideas, and it's a great document to look through when you're just in the beginning phases of knowing that you have some type of risk and hazard in your area. It gives a whole bunch of different type of projects, and it's a great resource for just the beginning phases of developing. It has a whole bunch of different types of projects, and you can, again, this isn't fully encompassing, so there's other types of projects that you can certainly think of that isn't in this, but it's a great idea to start. It literally is mitigation ideas. So that's the link too, and you'll be able to download these slides, so you don't need to scribble this down right away. So the steps of project scoping would, you'd first have to define the problem. So let's say, again, my plan has flooding. So my problem is flooding. My area floods. Okay, so what's my alternative? Could we elevate the house? Could we buy out the house? Could we relocate the house? Establish your criteria and evaluate your alternatives versus criteria. So maybe, yes, I want to buy it out, but what's the alternative? I could elevate it, I could relocate it, and you have to, choose what's right for your community. So maybe the alternative doesn't work because your community has a lot of investment in that area, or it's culturally sensitive. Your community wouldn't like that you would just buy out a whole bunch of houses and leave the area vacant. So that's the steps to really consider what your alternatives are versus the criteria of your initial project. And then choose your preferred alternative. What is your best option here for your project? Is it buying out? Is it relocating houses? Is it elevating houses? And again, those are just based on a flood scenario. So scoping alternatives here. Some major considerations when you are looking at alternative projects are your community support, right? So talking about the flood scenario, if you want to buy out 20 homes, well, maybe you haven't considered that homeowners might not like that. Have you spoke with them? Something to consider. Technical feasibility. Is the house built in the late 1800s and might fall apart if you elevate it? Could happen. So maybe it's not technically feasible. Cost and local funding. Do you have the funding for a project of whatever size? Maybe it's a $200,000 project and you're only eligible for the normal 75-25 cost share. Do you have 50 grand, whether in staff time or cash resources, to commit to this? Something to consider. Cost effectiveness. Is it effective? Are you achieving more than a 1 in your BCA through the FEMA software? Your environmental impacts. Are you going to be impacting the environment very detrimentally? Are you going to be imposing any risk? Would it pass EHP? Historic or cultural impacts. Is that area have maybe ancestral burial grounds that might have some big EHP issues if you start going through, because an archaeological survey would need to be conducted. So really think about all those types of ideas during this process. So when you select a project, there's several things you need to consider. The eligibility first and foremost. Is it eligible for another type of HMA program, such as HMGP or FMA, or maybe another federal agency? Maybe this isn't FEMA's specialty, and that can happen. You know, sometimes with levees and dams, other agencies have not priority, but better funding. Is it a national highway? FEMA doesn't fund that. Reduce vulnerability would be your second point here. Make sure that your level of protection for whatever your hazard is an improvement. Are you putting a culvert in that's, let's say, a 20-inch culvert and replacing it with a 20-inch culvert? That's just a replacement. That's not an improvement. How are you improving the level of protection in reducing your vulnerability by doing that? Number 3, is it consistent with your mitigation plan? May not be specifically listed, but is it consistent? Again, with your plan focus on flooding, now you try to submit an earthquake project. Make sure that there is some consistency in those. And 4, technical feasibility. It has to comply with engineering standards, building codes, and floodplain management regulations. So make sure that this project is something that can get reviewed by EHP and our office quickly, that it has these things, that it's not just an idea with nothing behind it. It is technically feasible. An engineer has looked at these houses. They are able to be moved, or they are able to be relocated, things like that. Number 5, your cost estimate. Isn't it reasonable? Is it thorough? Are you considering all the costs, the contractor estimates, your staff time, any type of things you may need to rent or purchase? Make sure it's very thorough, because once you submit your cost to us, you can't ask for more money. So that's very important. Cost effectiveness is considering the loss history and the hazard vulnerability. Is it cost effective? Is it a small hazard that happens every 100 years? It may not be cost effective. Now, are you flooding every year and $5,000 is, a big loss to a house worth $50,000? Then yeah, that's cost effective, but you will have to do a BCA through the FEMA software. But is it a cost effective project? Environmental and historical preservation. Fish and wildlife resources, endangered species, wetlands, floodplains, cultural resources. Are these some things that you're considering? Are you in a floodplain? Are you considering moving dirt where salmon or another endangered species are present? Something to consider. Would that pass EHP review? It most certainly could, but you want to make sure you have the right documentation. Public support, and again, community engagement, notices, meetings, support from your community and organizations. Does it have public support? If it doesn't, it's probably not a good project. You probably want to go look at your alternatives again. So make a list of these and check it twice, as we say, because you want to make sure you really meet these. And always document what you do. It's best to submit more documentation to us when you apply for either advanced assistance or the projects. So I'm going to pass this back to Stephen, and he is going to go over eligible project types.
So as you see with project scoping evolves very nicely into identification of a project, which then evolves nicely into development of a project application. If you've done a good project scoping and you've looked at all of those various elements, those are also the elements that you need in your project application. So what we're trying to emphasize here with our project scoping, we talked about this last 2 weeks ago also on our project application development webinar, is that so much good can be done for developing a solid, feasible, community-supported project in the scoping phase that it makes the project application development a lot easier. You've identified many of the issues you need to address, and you may have already gathered a lot of the data that you need for that as well. So as part of moving to the next part of the project application development, I wanted to just go back over eligible project types. There's a lot of good project types that are listed in the HMA guidance, and that's one of the resources for tribes in particular may not be aware of. All of our states use that HMA guidance on an everyday basis, but there's a link to the HMA guidance at the back of the slideshow. But there's some types of projects that are not really explained a lot or even mentioned, because that list in the HMA guidance is not intended as an exhaustive list. The HMA guidance is intended as a framework for for developing projects, for implementing projects once they're awarded, etc. So, we have a lot of very common project types, as Brenna was talking about, property acquisition and structure demolition for flood. But it's not just for flood, for avalanche. Yeah, we've done that in Alaska. Landslides, tsunamis, seismic fault zones. In California, they have mapped fault zone fracture areas for private or public structures. This is something a lot of tribes are not aware of, is that the FEMA grant funding can be used for private structures as well as public structures. It's just that the private landowners cannot apply directly to FEMA. They cannot even apply directly to the tribe. The tribe has to act as a sponsor and work with those private property owners to help them implement their own projects. And that is especially true with property acquisition and structural relocation or with structural flood elevations. Also, we do seismic, structural, and non-structural, can be both or just one or the other, of existing buildings, again, for private or public. For example, there's a residential retrofit project in Portland, Oregon for individual homes. It's about $5,000 per home. They actually have a 50-50 cost share, which is quite unusual. That's not the standard FEMA requirement. There are critical facilities across the Northwest, fire stations, police stations, schools, bridges, community centers that are publicly owned that have benefited from structural retrofit grant awards. Tsunami vertical evacuation shelters, yes, we fund those. That's not in the guidance, but yes, we fund those. And we funded our first one for FEMA nationwide in PDM 17 for the Shoalwater Bay Tribe, who has an area on the Tokelau Peninsula that cannot be evacuated between the time a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake hits and a tsunami enters Willapa Bay. We have Code Plus. What the heck is Code Plus? Well, building, this is a situation that you want to build a critical facility to a higher standard than is required by the building codes. The difference between the building code minimum requirements and the standard you want to build to is an eligible cost. It's a delta. So this is one of those weird situations where FEMA does fund new construction, but it's done in conjunction with way more local funding going into it than a 75-25 cost share. Emergency generators for critical facilities. Infrastructure hazard retrofits, utility systems, electrical grids, roads, bridges, water treatment plants, sewage treatment plants. We've talked flood, we've talked seismic, there's ice and windstorm, reinforcement of electrical grids or undergrounding of power lines across particular avalanche or wind pathways, that kind of thing. Localized flood risk reduction projects, including flood diversion and storage, floodplain restoration, stormwater management, especially stormwater projects that involve green infrastructure elements, erosion protection for buildings and infrastructure. A lot of people don't realize that that can be funded through PDM HMGP as well. Wildfire mitigation. 3 different kinds of activities right now are eligible under PDM: defensible space, vegetation management, and ignition-resistant construction. There are other types of projects that may result or may be oriented toward a wildfire mitigation issue that actually fall under the minor localized flood risk reduction project, or maybe it's under a stormwater management project or a utility system infrastructure retrofit. We also do drought mitigation, and that includes flood storage and aquifer recharge. There's a great new project in the Salinas River Valley in Puerto Rico, not California, that involves aquifer recharge in a very simple way. The excess water is allowed to seep into the ground and is then pumped out to municipal and irrigation wells later in the season when it's not when rainfall is not providing sufficient amount of water. Next slide is the resilient infrastructure. This is a primary goal. It's a primary focus of the PDM 18 cycle. $100 million has been set aside for this. They increased the cap on a project from $4 million to $10 million for resilient infrastructure, and they increased the period of performance from 3 years to 4 years. So you can see there is a serious interest in this. It's restricted to one per state grantee, but it's also one per tribe. So if a tribe is applying directly to FEMA, which you're eligible to do with your hazard mitigation plan in place and FEMA approved, you are eligible for one up to $10 million resilient infrastructure project. And that can include seismic retrofits, erosion, flood control, power grid hardening, stormwater management with green infrastructure, aquifer recharge and recovery, all sorts of things. These can include ecosystem benefits. 75% of the benefits of a resilient infrastructure project have to result from hazard risk reduction directly, whether it's flood or seismic or erosion, whatever it is. It has to be identified with the hazard risk reduction, reduced damages, reduced downtime for detours or having water systems out and not being providing the local community with water supply for several days. All of those kinds of benefits have to add up to at least 75%. But beyond 75%, many of these projects can incorporate ecosystems benefits, and ecosystem services can make up the remaining 25% or more of benefits for a project along these lines. Not every project is a fit for green infrastructure or ecosystems benefits, but many of the projects that we see, including the one shown there in the photograph, which is the Johnson Creek Stormwater Management Minor Localized Flood Control Project from PDM 2005 in the city of Portland, Oregon. Just as a reminder about ineligible activities, again, don't ask for these in your advanced assistance sub-application. Projects have to reduce the risk. So, for example, if you have a 25-year-old culvert that's deteriorated and not been maintained, and it now only provides 10-year flood protection, and you want to replace it, i.e. deferred maintenance, and bring it back up to 25 years, that's not eligible. You have to actually increase the level of protection above the original design in order to be eligible. Projects that are dependent on another phase of a project in order to be effective to meet BCA. That's one where you may not know that if you're applying for a project scoping advanced assistance sub-application, but just know that that could be one of the outcomes, is that you find out that the project that you want to do isn't cost effective on its own. You don't know that, though, until you start doing the feasibility analysis. Projects for which actual physical work has occurred prior to award, period, no exceptions. That applies to project application development for funded under advanced assistance. As I noted, constructing new buildings or facilities is generally not allowed, but there's all kinds of exceptions such as culvert to bridge upgrades, Code Plus projects, etc. Other ineligible project types include projects that just address operation, deferred, or future maintenance, repairs, or replacement. That's not what hazard mitigation is all about. Hazard mitigation is about improving the level of resilience and protection, not trying to reimburse the community for things that they have not had the funding to do in the past. There are other sources of funding, I believe, through EPA, EDA, and other organizations that may help with that, but not FEMA. Studies not directly related to design and implementation of a proposed project. Preparedness measures and response equipment, contaminated hazard areas, unless the site is cleaned up at non-grant expense and certified prior to closeout. So bear that in mind if you're doing a project application development.
Continued in the next section.